Greetings and welcome to a new round of MTGA tasting notes. We are getting through our fall releases, and next in the lineup is our 2021 Repechage Red Blend. This has been one of our newer wines in the program. We started making this wine in 2019, really as we are starting to ramp up our Cabernet Sauvignon production. And the reason why you see a lot of red blends kind of fall into the gap, say in between like our Merlot and our Cabernet, is because as we're making these other two wines and blending them together, there are going to be certain lots that simply don't make the cut. And what happens is, as a winemaker, is you don't want to let good wine go to waste. It's not that the wine's bad or flawed or anything like that. It just doesn't quite fit the mold for these two wines. So there might be a barrel or two barrels or maybe just gallons here and there that you're just not going to use. And you don't want to dump those down the drain. So what do you do with them? You try and find ways to repurpose them and provide them kind of that second chance. And that is what the word repechage is all about. It's actually a term that I learned when I was rowing in college. It is, in essence, the second chance race. If you don't qualify for the semifinal or the final, you can race again, and it's kind of the play-in game. If you had a poor performance the first time around, you can race again and hopefully jump back into the action. It is your second chance to get involved in kind of the main part of the tournament. And that is exactly what this wine has been since we started making it. The Merlot is always kind of first and foremost what we blend. Next is our Cabernet Sauvignon. And then after that, we see what is kind of falling through the cracks and what we can do with it. Now this happens as early as January after harvest. So we're talking when these wines are very, very young. They're only a few months old at this stage. And we know full well that this wine's gonna age for probably another 18 to 20 months in barrel before we finally bottle it. So there's a long way to go, even before we decide exactly what this wine is gonna be. With that in mind, the percentages on this wine will vary kind of year in and year out. More often than not, it's right around 55% Merlot and maybe about 45% Cabernet Sauvignon. Maybe there's a dash of Cabernet Franc in there, here and again, but those are typically the proportions. This particular year, the 2021, is sitting at 56% Merlot and 44% Cabernet Sauvignon. It's one of those things, and it's probably one of my favorite things about making this wine in particular, is that it requires kind of that trial and error and that iterating every single year to make it consistent year in and year out. The same proportions that I used for a prior vintage aren't necessarily going to work for the vintage we're working on, but that is kind of our control group. We want to taste that prior vintage, make sure we understand where it's at and what we like about it, and then try to, in essence, get as close as we can with the new vintage that we're putting together. So that's why you typically see those percentages change year in and year out. This has been such a fun wine to have in the lineup. It tugs on my heartstrings a little bit because of the tie-in to the Gonzaga rowing program that I was a part of for 4 years. But also, it's just an immensely fun wine to make because I get to be a mad scientist in the cellar, working with my graduated cylinders and my beakers, just kind of having at it. So let's get into it, shall we? Now, this is a wine that I definitely model after more like the right bank of Bordeaux. It definitely has its California flair because it's a little bit warmer, a little bit riper out here, but being Merlot based with Cabernet Sauvignon kind of backing it up and Cabernet Franc in there as well from time to time, it's definitely leaning more that direction. For that purpose, the barrels that we use are a little bit more typical of what you would see in that part of the world. We use a great cooperage that's kind of really the standard for this wine, along Fouquet. We use a Saint-Emilion barrel of theirs that they've been producing for quite some time. It's one of my favorite barrels to use, and it is kind of the linchpin that holds this wine together. It's a great asset for us here in the cellar. And this wine is just, it has that little bit of extra oomph. It's why we always put it here in between kind of the Cabernet and the Merlot, is that if you like these two wines, this is a shoo-in. It is the way to like bridge the gap between our Merlot program and our Cabernet Sauvignon program. And I gotta tell you that this is, the 2019, actually, probably the first time I made this wine was arguably my favorite vintage of it. But 2021, it's a vintage that has like the potential of being like a vintage of the decade. These wines are just that good. So this, it's hard for a winemaker not to say, oh, the new one's my favorite. It's kind of a cliche, but it's totally the case. This new release of our red blend, and we only did about 70 or so cases of it when it was all said and done, but it is definitely my favorite red blend that we've produced. It is absolutely lights out. Granted, I'm a little biased. I love my kids, but hell or high water, I'm standing by my words on that one. I mean, since our Merlot tends to lean a little bit more towards your red fruits, a little bit more acid driven in terms of the structure. Because of the Cabernet in this wine, it's a little darker, it's a little richer. The tannins are a little bit more pronounced, but they're very velvety. Think of like velvet cloth, how that feels like in between your hands. That's kind of how the tannins feel as you're drinking. It's just kind of this nice, soft feeling. And the finish just hangs right, it just goes and goes and goes. After you take a sip, the wine just kind of hangs about. It's in such a beautiful spot. 2021 is definitely one of my favorite vintages that I've had the pleasure of working on. And this is just a key example, a primetime example, if you will, of like why this vintage is just going to be so great as it continues to make its way out in the world. So highly recommend diving in on this wine. It was a joy to make. It's in such a beautiful spot. The new oak from that Saint Emilion style barrel is just singing. It's integrated so well where it's not heavy handed. There's just these nice toasty characteristics hanging about. This is going to be one that's, it's going to be one for the history books as far as MTGA and the program that we have. I'm very, very pleased with where this ended up. So thank you so much, as always, for tuning in. We're going to dive into our Cabernet Sauvignon in the next video, so stay tuned for that. Be sure to like, subscribe, share the video with all your wine-loving friends if they would like more information on MTGA. We're posting harvest updates, cellar updates, all kinds of great stuff, especially during the fall season that we're sitting in as we release these wines. So be sure to stay tuned for more of the good stuff from the MTGA cellar.